So we've discussed the Constitutional Convention, the basic outline of the Constitution as it was finalized and sent out to the people for a vote. If approved, that is referred to as ratification. We ratify, we approve of. And now, after discussing both that and the Bill of Rights that was necessary to convince the Anti-Federalists to support a vote on the Constitution, didn't have to agree with it, they could speak out against it, but they had to at least support putting it out to the people for a vote. So now we need to talk about the ratification debates. What was debated after this is put out to the people for a vote? It's submitted to the states for debate in September of 1787. We already went over that, and by June of 1788, it became the new government of the United States. The Federalist Papers, throughout the fall of 1787 and into the spring of 1788, were written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. Now these are a series of newspaper articles, editorials, like the opinion section of a newspaper, shall we say. It's later combined into a book called the Federalist Papers, but early on it's really just a series of articles. Now this defended the Constitution as a representative government that protected the personal liberties of all citizens. You could see here a digital snippet of a cover to like the Kindle version of the Federalist Papers. So although it's a famous book today, it's really nothing more than newspaper editorials trying to convince the people to vote in favor of the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists, however, two of the biggest Anti-Federalists were Patrick Henry of Virginia and Samuel Adams of Massachusetts. They lead the way with the Anti-Federalists. They feared that the central government, the federal government as we call it today, would become too strong and trample the rights of the people. They'd be in just as bad a shape under a strong federal government as they were under the British. In order to support the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists demanded a Bill of Rights be added to the document almost immediately after ratification. So you have Patrick Henry pictured in a painting here on the left, and he's obviously most known for his quote, "Give me liberty or give me death." You have a depiction here also of Samuel Adams, cousin to John Adams, and his famous quote, "It does not take a majority to prevail, but rather an irate, tireless minority, keen on setting brush fires of freedom in the minds of men." And so these two are very energetically anti-Constitution and speak out against it. But with most of the newspapers of the time period owned and operated by people who would call themselves Federalists, the numbers were 92 total newspapers. Only 12 published any of the Anti-Federalist essays, and the other 80 published only Federalist essays. So with only their ideas being put out there, the Federalists had a relatively easy time achieving the necessary 9 out of 13 states' approval. Now we get to what are some of the most significant constitutional principles. We've already discussed separation of powers, checks and balances, and how they're very frequently mixed up. People think they mean the same thing. They are similar, they relate to each other, but separation of powers is the easy part. Just saying, hey, let's have 3 branches of government. However, saying, which powers do we give the legislative branch? What about the executive branch? What about the judicial branch? And assigning different powers to each of the 3 branches very intentionally and methodically so that you would have a balance of power. No one branch would ever get too powerful. That is checks and balances, and is the much more difficult part. So some of the best examples of checks and balances, for example, the president vetoes a bill Congress has passed. So instead of signing it into law, it's been vetoed. Maybe there's enough votes in Congress where Congress overrides that presidential veto with a 2/3 majority vote in both houses of Congress. Or the Supreme Court declaring an act of Congress or the president or sometimes even a state law as unconstitutional. These are probably 3 of the most common examples that are going to be referenced repeatedly throughout the course. Other common examples, not quite as frequently happening as the first few. So the president nominates a Supreme Court justice, but the Senate rejects the appointment. That's them checking the power of the president. The president signs a treaty with another nation, but again, it's the Senate needs to approve. They reject that treaty. That's another check on the president. Congress disapproves of a war and cuts its funding. The president can send troops places, but without congressional support, there is no ability to pay for that war, and therefore it can no longer go on. Congress could approve funds for something, but then the president would delay sending the money, delay carrying it out. Congress appropriates funds for something, but the Supreme Court declares it unconstitutional. So these are all checks and balances each branch of government has. Now, to go back to separation of powers and checks and balances, I'd also like to use this graphic again, and I've cleared the annotations on the screen to show you that in general, if you were to try to describe to an elementary school kid what each branch of government does, the legislature makes the laws, but it's the executive branch that has to enforce those laws. And it is the judicial branch that interprets the law. Is it constitutional or not? What made me think to go back and say this was when I was reading aloud and annotating and discussing the Congress appropriates funds for something, but the president delays sending the money. I could give you the examples of education funding being approved by Congress, but the president not approving necessarily of the way it's going to be implemented, but he knows if he vetoes it, it's just going to get overridden. It was very popular in Congress. The president can, based on the presidential power to enforce or not enforce something, can choose to just delay getting that money out. Another historical example of this is when in 1832 there's a Supreme Court decision that says, hey, Andrew Jackson, the Indian Removal Act is unconstitutional, you can't do that. And he more or less says, yeah, but I enforced the law, so I'm going to go ahead and do it. Go ahead and try to stop me. There are times in history, some more controversial than others, obviously when you are forcibly removing people from their land after the Supreme Court says you can't do so, it is going to be more controversial than something as seemingly petty as education funding, especially petty in comparison, that there are a lot of ways checks and balances are both legally used and kind of like manipulatively used. Not necessarily illegal, but manipulative. The last couple of terms I want to go over with you. Federalism versus federal supremacy. These are two terms, much like checks and balances and separation of powers, that can get confused. Okay? Federalism is the balance of power between the federal and state governments. Federal supremacy, however, is when an enumerated power, something specifically listed in the Constitution, is in question. The federal government shall remain supreme. So a state can't mess with something that has to do with an enumerated power. And oftentimes it's the Supreme Court that needs to clarify that. This is in Article 6, Section 2 of the Constitution, as well as the 10th Amendment reserving certain powers to the states. Things unmentioned in the Constitution mainly. And it is early Supreme Court cases that we will learn about when we go through the three branches of government that we will learn a whole lot more about in a whole lot more detail. If you have any questions on this, don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, I'll see you in class.